Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So, we are a week away from spring break, and I don't know about you, but I am ready for some time off. Many of us are students, or work with students, or were once a student, so I know I don't need to tell you how absolutely tiring the rhythm of this semester can be. As I pore over midterm papers and many, many cups of coffee, the disciples' weariness on the mountain is something I can easily relate to. As many of you know, I'm a third-year student at Candler School of Theology. As part of the Master of Divinity requirements, every student has to take an Intro to Preaching class. My professor, Dr. Fry Brown, taught me that the first thing to do when preaching a sermon is to simply read the text, to read it and sit with it and see what stands out to you. And the second thing she said about preparing for a sermon is that when you preach, sometimes you preach to other people, and sometimes you preach to yourself. So I tell you all of this because when I first read this passage from Luke, I know I should have felt something like inspiration at the revelation of Jesus' divinity, or maybe unbelief at the appearance of Moses and Elijah and the voice of God coming from the cloud. But to be honest, all that struck me in this entire passage is that the disciples were tired. And it was this seemingly insignificant detail in an otherwise theologically fundamental passage that stood out to me, and I couldn't shake it. All I could think about is how Jesus brought his three closest disciples up to the mountain with him to pray, and right there in the middle of the transfiguration, Peter and James and John are falling asleep. So as I continue to reflect on this passage and the way that the disciples react to the transfiguration, I realize that maybe there is a message for all of us who are tired and weary. We have many reasons to be weary in this season of life, but what was going on with the disciples? Why were they so tired? To understand this, we need to go back in the gospel. This passage and this particular Sunday signifies a shift in Jesus' journey. The transfiguration scene falls near the end of his Galilean ministry and soon before he begins his travels to Jerusalem. At this point in their journey, Jesus and his disciples have been traveling throughout Galilee, preaching and performing miracles. Recently, the disciples have heard questions about who Jesus is and Peter's declaration that he is the Messiah, followed by Jesus' prediction of his suffering and death in Luke 9:22. So the transfiguration scene is set in this context, as the disciples are trying to figure out what the future will hold, especially if these predictions come true. The disciples are weary from their travels, but perhaps even more, I think they are struggling to live in this in-between time. Transfiguration Sunday marks a time in between for the modern disciple as well. This Sunday is a transition Sunday between the season after Epiphany and the season of Lent. We've spent the past handful of weeks talking about the earthly ministry of Jesus, the disciples' mission to preach and heal, and our own call to discipleship, to live a risky faith and be agents of God's justice. This coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, which officially marks the beginning of Lent, a season of fasting and preparing our hearts and minds for the coming betrayal, death, and resurrection of Christ. As we try to figure out how to live well as modern disciples, we are caught in the weariness of the world. We are surrounded by news of children being separated from their parents on the border, of Black and brown bodies being targeted on the streets, and natural disasters resulting from the impending ecological crisis. Our church is weary from the struggle of finding new ways to be relevant in the contemporary world while grappling with the traditions of our past. Just this past week, the United Methodist Church passed a proposal which strengthens prohibitions against LGBTQ+ ordination and marriage. So we are tired from living in this time of transition, and we are waiting hopefully for something better to come in the future. The disciples in this passage, the global contemporary church, and all of us as individuals are called and challenged to figure out what it means to live as disciples who are weary in between times. This passage encourages us to strike a balance between two paths of discipleship. The text suggests that it is okay to withdraw to the mountain when we are weary, and the transfiguration motivates us to social action, to engage directly in the things that are making us so tired. In this story, we're given hope in the presence and glory of God, which is revealed in the transfiguration. The passage we are looking at today starts with Jesus bringing Peter, James, and John up to the mountain with him to pray. In the Gospels, we see Jesus retreat to pray at significant moments in his journey, and we are reminded that divine revelation happens in moments of prayer. In the text from today, the transfiguration happens exactly during this contemplative time. What struck me again, though, was how the disciples react to what they are witnessing. They see Jesus in all his dazzling glory, and Peter suggests they build structures, booths, on the mountain. This points back to the Jewish celebration of the Festival of Booths, which remembers the Israelites' wilderness journey from Egypt to Canaan. Many theologians suggest that Peter's intent to build booths indicates his desire to stay in this mountaintop high experience that often comes with spiritual encounters. However, I think Peter's suggestion has less to do with this and more to do with the ways that we so easily fall into the traps of doing what we've always done. When we find ourselves in the weariness of the in-between, it is far easier to take cues from our past than to engage in the work of creating new solutions for the future. However, the next part of the text tells us that Jesus and the disciples come down off the mountain and are confronted with the task of casting out a demon who had possessed a young boy. This suggests, as Jan Richardson says in the poem we heard earlier, that this is not a blessing to stay on the mountain. When we experience divine revelation, we need to take this blessing, this message, off the mountain and into the world. From this story, we can understand our call to engage in risky justice work. Annie Dillard, an American author and poet, speaks to our desperate need to engage in the brokenness of the world. She says, Thomas Merton wrote, "There is always a temptation to diddle around in the contemplative life, making itsy-bitsy statues. There is always an enormous temptation in all of life to diddle around, making itsy-bitsy friends and meals and journeys for itsy-bitsy years on end. It is so self-conscious, so apparently moral, simply to step aside from the gaps where the creeks and winds pour down, and then to sulk along the rest of your days on the edge of rage. It is so easy, as the disciples exemplified, to make booths, to pray, to sit in the grace of God. But this, as Annie Dillard and Thomas Merton say, is not all that we are called to do. Thomas Merton is an American Catholic monk and author who provides a good example of how to strike the balance between the contemplative life and our call to engage directly with the complexities and evils of the world. As a young adult, Merton was a writer and a poet. He was politically active, involved in leftist demonstrations, and was interested in Eastern religions. His studies, though, eventually led him to the Catholic tradition, and he followed a call to the monastic life, joining a monastery in Kentucky when he was in his mid-20s. For many years, he lived alone as a hermit on the end of the monastery's property, reading and writing. Merton, however, never completely lost his zeal for political action, and this was renewed when he met a young man named Ernesto Cardenal, who wanted to become a priest and start a new monastery in Mexico, a monastery that would be deeply concerned with seeking justice in the grossly unjust societies of Central America. Merton's relationship with Cardenal was extremely formative for him. Throughout the second half of the 1950s, Merton had come to believe that his monastic isolation had made him inattentive to the evils of the world. He was interested in living in between the contemplative and the political, between praying and seeking God's vision for the world and going into the creeks and gaps, the trenches and the messiness of the world. Merton wrote in a letter to Cardenal that we must pray and be joyful and simple because we do not, after all, understand most of it. But let us avoid false optimism and approved gestures and seek truth. Truth-seeking often involves risks and danger, and a willingness to be radical disciples in a world that often rejects us. Jesus calls for an inbreaking of the kingdom of God on earth. His compassion and healing reaches out to those who are often ignored, and in his parables, he challenges his followers to consider the poor, the hungry, the widow, and the orphan. Similarly, we are called to challenge systems and structures that perpetuate injustice, and to make God's enduring love known to everyone. How difficult it is, though, to seek enduring love in times of enduring weariness. And who knows this better than the disciples who, in this story, have just come from a long period of traveling with Jesus as he performed miracles and faced demons. And so they end up on that mountain, falling asleep, because the work in the gaps where the creeks and winds fall is not easy. Though this passage reminds us of the importance of coming off the mountain and engaging with the brokenness of the world, it also reminds us that sometimes we need to withdraw into the silence and peace of the contemplative so that we can listen to the one who calls us. This story tells us that there is power in prayer to bring forth the presence of God during the in-between times, and that our hope comes from knowing that Christ's death is not the end of the story. The Transfiguration not only reveals Jesus as the final fulfillment of what Moses started when he led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, but it also points ahead to Christ's crucifixion and resurrection in Jerusalem. The Transfiguration is a foreshadowing of Jesus' return in glory, fulfilling Jesus' saying in 9:26 that he will die and on the third day be raised and enter into his glory. In the Transfiguration event, Jesus is clear about his mission, which continues the redemptive work of God from the Exodus through the end times. Although we have not witnessed the Transfiguration firsthand, we are given eschatological hope. The story assures us of Christ's resurrection and of the future reign of God's kingdom. We are left with the promise that God's presence prevails in the midst of great suffering, and that one day we too will be resurrected to join Christ for all of eternity. This passage reminds us to create space for divine encounter where we can listen to God. It points us back to the one who has called us and reminds us that God's glory empowers us to engage in the transformative and healing work of Jesus' ministry, the same work that we are called to do. So when we are tired and weary from living in these in-between times, when we hear predictions that upset us and are not sure of what comes next, when we are wrestling to reconcile our past with a future that is largely unclear, how are we, the modern, weary disciples, responding? When faced with injustice, do we act indifferently and do what we've always done, with the easy way out, with a lot of talk about what's wrong and all of the things that fill us with rage? Or are we persistently and enthusiastically looking for ways to combat broken systems that create disparity, violence, and adversity? And finally, in this work, are we remembering to search for God and listen to how God is persuading us and leading us to do justice by following the example of Christ? Amen.